much for joining us here this evening. It is always a pleasure here at the Grammar School at Leeds to have such fantastic partnership projects. They mean so much to us because we really are proud of the fact that this school has been rooted in the city of Leeds for almost 500 years, albeit on different sites and in different guises. So the partnership that we have with our community and the diversity of that community that reflects the family that is the Grammar School at Leeds is really important to us. And Mirjam is a classic example of a partnership project that we absolutely love. It's especially lovely for me this evening, though, I have to say, on a personal note as well, because in addition to welcoming all of you here, I'm also welcoming somebody I did know many moons ago in another life, Lord Finkelstein, who I know as Danny. And poor Danny, of course, was thinking, well, I think she had dark hair and she didn't have glasses when I last met her 30 years ago. But he was far too polite to say that. I have to say, though, tonight, having read the book, which I know many of us will have done, others, of course, can buy it this evening, having read the book and been so moved by it, because I was moved to read it from the excerpts in the Times, I think it is really special that we have got Lord Finkelstein with us this evening. Not least because of the topic that he's going to talk about, but because he is such a distinguished person in his own right, as a writer, a journalist, a broadcaster. He brings a breadth of understanding and an amazing way with words to reach out to us. And so lots of us will be regular readers of his columns, but actually having the chance to hear him in person and hear him reveal such a personal story and the power it can have in our lives and the lessons we can learn from it actually makes this evening particularly special. So with no further ado, I'm handing over to the main event. Jonathan Straight is going to speak with Lord Finkelstein. Thank you for being here.
Well, welcome to you all and good evening. And it's a real delight to welcome you all. It's a delight to welcome Lord Finkelstein here to the Grammar School at Leeds. With the people we have here and those at home all around the world, we believe this is the biggest audience Mirjam has ever had. So a real milestone in our 7-year history. So thank you all for coming and thank you to those logging on at home. Before we get into a conversation, though, we have a real treat for you. We're approaching the Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah, which falls on Friday night. And through the month of Elul, which approaches the New Year, each day we blow the shofar, the ram's horn. It's something which calls to our hearts and asks us to look into ourselves and mend our ways, I suppose. So it's my great pleasure to invite an old boy of the school, an old Leo, Rabbi Reuven Cohen, who will blow a few notes on the shofar, and then we'll look forward to the conversation. Thank you. I mean, these things happen in Leeds. Exactly. So welcome, Danny. And we're talking about this book, Hitler, Stalin, Mum and Dad, which is really a remarkable piece of writing. I'm sure many of the audience have read it, but probably many too haven't. Can you sum up briefly what the book's about?
Absolutely. Let me first say, first of all, thank you so much for coming. Sue, thank you for that fantastic introduction. You made me sound fascinating. I can't wait to hear myself. I sound brilliant. And Rabbi, that was wonderful and a sort of moving introduction. So first of all, my thanks. I'll give you a little summary. This is a book about my parents, as the title suggests. My father was the son of a very wealthy businessman. He was so wealthy in the iron and steel trade that his nickname was the Iron King. He lived in Lwow, which we now know as Lviv. And when the Germans invaded Poland from one side, the Russians, by agreement, entered from the other side. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, between those two things, or the Hitler-Stalin Pact, which had let Hitler effectively invade the Low Countries, that is how my mother ended up being trapped by Hitler, also let the Soviets take over part of Poland when the Nazis did. Because my grandfather was a very wealthy man, also a civic leader and a leader of the Jewish community, he was arrested and sent to the gulag, and my father was deported along with my grandmother. What people probably don't know about the war is at the same time as the Holocaust was taking place, hundreds of thousands, possibly more than 1 million Poles were deported by Stalin to Siberia and Kazakhstan, and only really were released because Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. So I tell the story of my father's travels, how he nearly died in Siberia, and of his ultimate survival. And the story begins and ends in Hendon Central.
So we'll pick up in more detail on some of those things as we go along, hopefully. But the title of the book is interesting. And I know when we were organising this event, there's a big banner outside with your name on. And we were hesitant to put the name of the book on it. In fact, I don't think we did put the name of the book on the banner. And I noticed in America, the book has a different title. I wondered why.
Yes, so it's called Two Roads Home in the United States. They haven't entirely said why. One reason they gave is that mum and dad isn't a common phrase in America. But I suspect it's because they think it's too flip, that it has a certain British humour quality to it. Really, that wasn't the reason for choosing it, though definitely it gave it a bit more punch. The reason for choosing it is it's incredibly difficult to summarise a book that has two stories in it. You either go for something quite vague, they've Two Roads Home is the example, but actually I had originally the idea of it's not a competition. That being my mother's phrase when anyone asks her who was worse, Hitler or Stalin. That was kind of vague, so we didn't want to use that either. The original title under which the book was bought by HarperCollins and by Doubleday in the States was Love and Murder. And while Robert Harris, who's my friend, the novelist, said, that's good because it's two different sections of the bookshop. The Doubleday sales force said they didn't think people wanted to read a book that appeared to promise to end only in murder. And that one of the things that people like, and I hope that's true about the book, is that for all the terrible things that happen in it, it's also a story of miraculous survival. So once you eliminate lots, you end up with a straightforward title that just expresses what's in the book. And I think it's been a strength of the book that it's done that. So I'm happy with the title here. I was surprised that they wanted to change it, but they're very experienced in the United States and they know what they're doing.
Was there a particular catalyst that made you write the book?
So I've always known I was going to write this book. So my brother and sister, they're both very literate, but they've both sort of got more administrative careers, and I've been the writer. But even when I was young, 10 or 11, I always thought one day this will be a book, and I think it'll be me that writes it, which was extraordinary because I was kind of really quite bad at English at school. So I don't know why I thought I could write a book, but I always thought I could write this. And I always knew it had to be written. And people have asked me, well, why did you do it now? And it's slightly embarrassing that the true answer is because somebody became my agent. And I was too embarrassed to tell him I wasn't going to write a book for him, even though he was my agent. And so you kind of ended up in that conversation. And we agreed that if I was going to write a book, it had to be about this. And then he sort of started to talk to publishers. And so then soon I had a deadline and I had no choice but to write it. That's really why it appeared now. There was a difficulty with doing this book that only being able to do it recently overcame. And that is, I don't speak any other language other than English. My dad spoke 9 languages. My mum spoke 3. Lots of the correspondence is in Polish, German and Dutch. Polish is completely incomprehensible to anybody who doesn't actually speak it. You can't even read it. You can't even transcribe a letter that's in Polish with all the letters and stuff like that. So I was worried about it, but eventually the internet and the translation meant that I could. So just give you an example. There's 26 pieces of correspondence between my grandfather, Alfred, that's my mother's father, who was the archivist, and Otto Frank. The Franks and my family and my family knew each other, and the Wiener family knew each other in Amsterdam. And after the war, Otto Frank saw Alfred frequently when he was in London. His second wife had children in London. He came to London quite a lot. He was in a hotel called Clarendon Court in Maida Vale, and my grandfather would go and visit him there, and they had all this correspondence. As it turned out, only 3 of these letters were of any interest. And I had those properly translated, but the other 23 I had translated using Google Translate. And you don't get a brilliant one, but you can basically see, oh, this is just Otto saying, I'm sending you a book, I'll meet you on Thursday, where shall we go? Well, and that sort of thing. Whereas the other 3 were about the authentication of Anne's diaries, so they were much more interesting. So, although it would have been better to do this book while my parents were alive, because there were questions I couldn't ask them, I'm not sure I've been able to do it without the internet.
I was also interested in the timing of the book, and particularly with reference to something you say quite early on, which is about, could this happen again?
Yes, my 50th birthday party. You're quite right. So right at the beginning, the book, one of the things that's right at the beginning of the book is my 50th birthday party, and I'm saying thank you to all the people you say thank you to, but I also wanted to say thank you to this country, because it's often occurred to me, sometimes people ask you, aren't you sorry that the big ideas in politics, there are no big ideas in politics? And my response to that is, the big ideas, they killed my grandmother, they exiled my grandfather, they had a good go at starving my mother to death and at freezing my father to death. They stole every coffee cup, every sofa, every piece of property that we had, and they threw us across the world. So I like the small ideas of this country. So my toast was to Brent Cross Shopping Centre, and to the local dry cleaner, and to the Sunrise Cafe in North Harrow. And I said, the great thing about this is I can tell you in confidence that my children won't be sent to fight in some faraway war, and I don't have to fear somebody knocking on the door in the middle of the night. And the purpose of saying all that, was at that time I felt a great confidence in those things. And I was reflecting, would I say that 10 years later? And this as I was beginning to work on this book. And I'm not sure I would with the same confidence. Could I be certain that wasn't true? I don't think it's true. I think we are safe in this country, but I don't think I have the same feeling of confidence. And that's true all over the world, not just in Ukraine, but in Hungary, actually in Poland, and, worst of all, in the United States of America. So some of this was at least partly prompted by the election of Donald Trump and the fact that happened despite its possible consequences and the rise of conspiracy theories. And of course, more recently, the Jewish community had the experience of Jeremy Corbyn being leader of the Labour Party. So on both right and left, at least the shadow fell, and I felt that telling the story was important at that time.
Now, you set the book out as a sort of before, during, and after the events. So maybe if we can go back to your mother and her childhood, where was your mother born? What sort of circumstances did she grow up in? So
let me start with my grandfather, Alfred, coming back from the war in 1918. He's fought, a solid war and nearly died actually of disease. He's been he's worked on the front and he's been a journalist for the newspapers, and he comes back, and lots of Jews are expecting that they'll complete the civic equality that seemed to be promised before the First World War. But Alfred feels that his comrades in arms have been embittered, and that there is a real danger that the pogroms that you saw in Russia could visit Germany. And he writes a book, a tract really, because it's short, arguing if we don't do anything, we will speak to our descendants of bestial murder. And he publishes this in 1919, as you can see. And I think he has, as a result of that, got claimed to be one of the very first people to see what was happening in Germany. He then joins an organisation which he rises to the top of, called the Zentralverein, which is the Central Committee of Jews of Jewish faith, of Germans of Jewish faith. And he sets about going across the country, basically repelling libels against Jews, addressing mass meetings in cities where there's been a rumour that Jews are involved in ritual murder of babies, the blood libel. And often these meetings are broken up by far-right activists. And he begins he creates a sort of secret collection of material on the Nazis. He's collecting everything they say, all of their press releases, pictures of everybody. By the way, after the war, when Mengele is in Argentina, or at least the rumour is Mengele is in Argentina, the problem was nobody knew what he looked like. And Alfred had the only picture of Mengele because he collected all this material. So he collects it and he's using it for doing things like he sued Julius Streicher, the editor of Die Stürmer, and sends him to jail actually. And in 1933, when the Nazis get in, despite everything Alfred has been doing, he gets called to a meeting with Goering. Much of this meeting is quite reassuring. That Goering's telling the Jewish community, as long as you don't, as long as you don't do anything communist, we won't harm you. That's what he says. And then as Alfred's leaving, he says, by the way, I know about your archive and you have to destroy it. So actually this meeting was very menacing. And there was a second meeting with Goering. It's even more menacing because the Nazis felt he'd been too soft on the Jews the first time, so he calls them back in again. And Alfred gets out of Germany. He goes to Holland, and just at that moment, this is June 1933, my mother's born. So my mother, I think of as a Dutch child. Actually, she was German. I mentioned the Frank family earlier. Anne Frank, we always think of a little Dutch girl. Anne Frank was actually a little German girl. By the time they arrived in Amsterdam, they were all refugees. Anne from Frankfurt, my mother from Berlin. And my mother spends her youth, therefore, quite happily in Amsterdam until May 1940, when Alfred's already gone to London with the library and then ends up helping the British war effort, and the family's trapped when the Nazis invade.
The collection, did he manage to save it when Goering was
No, so he doesn't. So what happens with the archive is that they flee Berlin with the archive, and effectively they're being chased by the German authorities, and eventually it's decided it was unsafe to keep. So somewhere in Bavaria, they destroyed the archive. My grandfather's gone to Amsterdam in a place called Jan van Eyckstraat in the Jewish area of Amsterdam. He lives at number 16. He knocks through into number 14 and they begin to build again. And they build an archive, this time much bigger actually. And that archive still does exist. So that is next year celebrating, the 90th anniversary of what's called the Wiener Holocaust Library. And that it's in Russell Square now.
Okay, so that's your mother's story so far. Your father, you said, grew up in Lwow.
Yes.
What was his story?
So as I said, my grandfather, Dolu, and Lusha, his wife, was they lived a grand life in the middle of this cosmopolitan city. There was a lot of anti-Semitism in Poland, but on the other hand, in Lwow, it wasn't possible for Jews to avoid that anti-Semitism. And indeed, towards the end of the 1930s, a number of students were the subject of anti-Semitic murder. There was a huge rally of 10,000 people that attends Marcus Landsberg's funeral. And my grandfather, I've got the documents, who was very much involved with supporting the student community of Lwow and financially was sort of part of the protest movement against that. But he builds up his business during the 1920s and early 1930s and builds a beautiful Art Deco house on the hill in Herbertov Street. There have been Finkelsteins in Lwow for hundreds of years by this point, and they assume they're going to be there for many years to come, but they only live in this house for a year, the one that they built. They have one son, my father, Ludwik, because Lwow had to have a cesarean section and they didn't think they would be able to have any more children. But the idea was eventually Ludwik would grow up and he'd take over the business and probably finance the synagogue and be on the city council like Lwow. But none of that happened.
So what happened to them? What was
I'll take you through my father first as we're on that story. When the Soviets take over, they brought their economic system with them. And both the Nazis and the Soviets had the idea that the spirit of the people was being frustrated by the elites. They just had and that idea is probably familiar to everybody because it's become a currency in politics now. And they just had a different idea who the elites were. So the Nazis arrested all the Jews, some of whom happened to be shopkeepers, and the Soviets arrested all the shopkeepers, some of whom happened to be Jews. And they thought that these people were all elites, despite the fact that my mother was part of the elite at the age of 10 and my father part of the elite at the age of 10. But in the Soviet Union, they set about arresting anybody who's got any slight middle-class pretension, essentially, so they can decapitate Poland. That was their idea. And you would be, even if you were a head teacher, so I'm afraid, if you had a business of any size, being like a large shop would be of any size, you would be arrested, and you'd be arrested if you were a philatelist and had international contacts, or you spoke Esperanto. It really didn't require much, or you were just unlucky. And they arrested those people, and my grandfather was arrested, and the burden of the charge against him was that he was accused of wanting to strengthen the might of capitalist Poland, which indeed he did. And eventually he is sentenced to 8 years in the gulag for being an anti-social element. He doesn't, there are lots of interrogation that goes into that, but none of it was of any worth because it didn't require that really. It's a tribunal of 3 people who make that, and the sentence was pretty arbitrary. But what they did was they told all the families, yes, we've taken your husbands and they're being questioned, but don't worry, you'll be reunited with them in 4 days' time. We'll come back to you. And 3 days after they'd arrested the husbands, they arrested all the families. My father is sent with my grandmother to Kazakhstan, right on the border with Siberia, to a state collective farm where there's nowhere to live and nothing to eat. They're first of all put into cattle sheds, and eventually from the cattle sheds, in winter they build a house out of cow dung, which, as you can imagine how good my grandmother was at building. So the house, part of it collapsed, and it was freezing inside the whole winter. The only reason they survived without really almost anything to eat and nothing to heat up is because they weren't actually arrested. They were simply deported. And what they were done wasn't really described as arrest. They were deported. They weren't actually criminals. They could receive packages. And my grandmother's siblings in Lwow, with the very little money they were left with, because everything had been confiscated, sent them packages. I know this because when I was doing the book, I'd found a plastic bag full of 90 letters that had gone from Lwow to Siberia that my grandmother had kept. And these had Polish written right into the edge of it, and they were all obviously they were quite messy and tattered, but they were clear enough to read, and somebody translated them for me.
Your father is in the gulag. Your mother is in Amsterdam.
Yes.
What's her fate?
So, what happens to the Jews in Amsterdam is that they began after 1942, when the Wannsee Conference, the Nazis moved from one policy, which was to exclude Jews from social life, to the second policy, which was to exclude Jews from the territory of Germany. And excluding Jews from the territory of Germany, they used a phrase called deportation to the east. But actually, they weren't deporting them to the east. They were deporting them to gas chambers. So this Wannsee Conference shifts what happens to Jews from 1942 onwards. But some Jews, about between 8 and 16,000, it depends on what the time was, were in the position that they had something called a Sperr, or a stamp on their card, that suggested they were exempt from deportation for now because they were helping with the administration of the Jewish community. So they were the people supplying the Jewish markets, or they were actually working for the Jewish Council in some form. Lots of these jobs were make-work schemes created by the Jewish Council to increase the number of people who were exempt. But in 1943, this scheme began to come to an end, and my grandmother, who'd been working on refugee aid almost all her life and was involved in that in Amsterdam, she lasted until June 1943. She then lost her exemption, and on 20th of June 1943, about 5,000 Jews were arrested in Amsterdam, of which my mother and her sisters and my grandmother were among them. They went to a place called Westerbork. Westerbork was a camp that had been built by the Dutch, using Jewish money to house illegal refugees who'd come across from Germany before the war. Now it was repurposed by the Germans to house the Jewish prisoners that every Tuesday they sent to the gas chambers. And that's how my great aunt, my grandmother's sister, Trudy, and my great uncle, Jan, and my mother's first cousin, Fritz, that's how they all died. They sent to a place called Sobibor. But they didn't send absolutely everybody there. They were looking, Himmler had the idea, we may not win this war. Let's see whether we can take some Jews hostage and swap them for some money or for some Germans who were living in Allied occupied countries, or for military equipment. And they gave out these, and they went through Westerbork looking for people who had exemptions. And my mother had something that said that she was a citizen of Paraguay. Now, obviously, she wasn't a citizen of Paraguay. None of us got anything to do with Paraguay. These had been falsely created by a group of Poles living in Switzerland. And the group of Poles living in Switzerland, the Polish government in exile knew more than most people what was happening to the Jews. And although it's famous that the Polish community, some people were, indifferent to the fate of the Jews, others really weren't. And these people played a heroic role. And they created for thousands of people, hundreds of passports. And my family were recipients of one of these for various complicated reasons, which the book explains, amazing coincidence reasons, which the book explains. They were one of only 136 people that ultimately were involved in an exchange involving these South American passports. There were only 2 or 3 exchanges in the war, one for a group of people who had Palestine certificates because there were some Germans called Templars who lived in Palestine. One that was swapped by a man called Kastner, the Kastner train from Hungary, separate exchange, and one of 136 people involved in these Paraguayan passports. And my mother was one of these 136 people.
Now, I think as you alluded to when you started speaking, the Nazi story is well known. It's told in many books, in films, but the Soviet-Polish situation is not quite so well understood. Why do you think that is the case?
Well, because they won. They joined Hitler invaded the Soviet Union and they joined the winning side. And so I tell you, when I was going to do the book, the first thing I did was to go to a file that had been given to me by my father's second wife, and my grandfather's second wife, I apologise. She gave me a folder which included things like his obituary in the New York Times, or the tribute that had been paid to him by Ludwik, who was Chancellor of Germany when he died, that sort of thing. And I wanted to look at those things. I thought it was a good place to start. And I remembered that quite a bit of it was in English, so I thought it'd be a good place to start. And I opened the folder, and the first thing in the folder, which I didn't remember being there, but was my grandfather's personal copy of the indictment of the Nuremberg conspirators, which is quite an extraordinary thing to have. And so the first thing I did was open that, and I read it, and I realised, as well as being, very compelled by its what it told about my mother's story, that the Soviets were guilty of all of the four main crimes that the Nuremberg defendants were prosecuted for. That is, they were guilty of crimes against humanity, crimes against peace, war crimes, and conspiracy to commit the other three crimes. They were guilty of each of those things. And they weren't found guilty of it because they were the prosecuting authority. Indeed, they even tried prosecuting the Nazis. This bit did fail, for something called the Katyn massacre. So one of the stories told in the book is of a man called Major Ignacy Schrager. Major Ignacy Schrager was the stepfather of my father's best friend. My father's best friend Aldona and Yadja, they are sent to the state collective farms as well. They're deported as well. But Ignacy was arrested early in the war and was with a group of officers. He's questioned, and then one day it looks like he's going to be released. He's put on a transport that looks like it's taking him back to Lwow. But they stop on the way and they say, we do need to do one more round of questioning. They take him downstairs to this questioning. He's asked for his name and his date of birth. He gives both, Ignacy Schrager, and he gives the date of his birth. And they say, you can go. And he turns around and they shoot him in the back of the head. And they did this to 22,000 people. And some of those were buried in the Katyn forests. Not all of them, but some of them were, where they're later discovered. And they gave the name to all the people who were killed, the Katyn massacre. And the Nazis tried prosecuting, the Soviets tried prosecuting the Nazis for that crime. It petered out, but they got away with it because they were on the other side. But there's a huge correspondence between what they did and what the Nazis. It wasn't the same thing. There's something special about, something specially horrific about, in my book, what's told the Sobibor story, that kind of factory of death, the concentrating of people, the placing them on a train and then deliberately sending them off where you're going to murder them at the end. But the Soviets sent my father on 3 weeks of cattle truck, and at the end, he was in this hut, and they basically thought he would starve to death in 2 or 3 winters. So how much better that really was, as my mother said, it's not a competition.
The Ignacy Schrager story is one of the shocking parts of the book that really sort of stuck with me, having read many parts of the book which are shocking. But what I was interested to know is how, given that he didn't survive, how were you able to recreate that story, even down to the dialogue, in such detail?
So this is an interesting point which will be of interest to, and I've written about it in the Jewish Chronicle, either for this week or last week, I can't remember now, but which is, how do you set about finding out about your family if you don't know very much? Now, I was lucky, I knew a lot, but nevertheless, there are bits that you don't know very much about. And I realised something very early on, which is that there are 2 things I realised. One is that every single document has got every line tells you a piece of information if you read it carefully enough. That was the first thing. I came across a passport that said that my grandfather was 5'7", just as an example. It was an old discarded British passport. It had no intrinsic value, but it told me that. So that was the first thing I learned. And the second thing was this: everything that happened to my family happened to someone else as well. So my mother and her sister were at variance in their witness statements, and neither of them are alive for me to ask, about what sort of trains they took between Amsterdam and Westerbork and Belsen and Belsen and Kreuzlingen, right? What did they take? And I thought, well, how am I going to sort this out? And then I thought, well, if they were on this train, 20th of June, 1943, I knew all the dates, someone else would be on it. And indeed, a man called Peter Oppenheimer had written a book called From Belsen to Buckingham Palace, and he saw one train and wrote down what kind it was. and was on another one and said what kind it was. So I knew the answer. In the Ignacy-Schrager case, they shot 22,000 people. When they finally came round to admitting it, one of the guards, as it happened at the place where Ignacy was killed, gave a witness statement, and the witness statement was, we did the same thing with everyone. Here's what we did. We took them down the stairs. They were holding their arms, I think. We took them into the room. We read, this person sat here, this person sat there. They said exactly this. The person would reply. I then was able to insert what I knew Ignacy must have said when he was asked what his name or his birthday was, because that I knew. And then they said this. We then shot him with this pistol in the back of the head, and then we took him out. So I knew that's what had happened.
Incredible. We could talk in a lot of detail about the stories of your family, but given time is short, maybe we should speak in more general terms about the book, and then we'll throw it open to the audience. You've got two stories here, which you've managed to weave together in a very skillful manner. How challenging?
Charming, isn't it?
How challenging was it to actually create a coherent narrative from two very different timelines?
One of the things that worried me a lot when I started is this. The date of my father's arrest is the 13th of April, 1940. And the date of my mother's arrest is the 20th of June, 1943. My father has, by that point, sort of come out the other end. He is not yet completely safe, but they are basically in Palestine and Tel Aviv and with the army. There was a timeline issue that I had to sort out. And the answer is that one of the reasons I go back and forth between the different stories was partly you had to do that, otherwise you'd end up telling two lumpy stories, but partly because if you sort of split the story up, in fact, you could align the time so that you don't end up jumping about too much. And this is the reason why the bulk of my mother's story comes right at, towards the end of the book, and my father's more in the middle, because that was how they actually happened. So that was definitely a challenge, but there were lots of things like, should you put a timeline in and everything? And I just thought, once I can crack doing the story. So once I'd written the book proposal and I'd cracked that problem, the rest of the book was a lot easier to write. But it was an issue at the beginning, definitely.
Let's move on, because I think people need to read the book for the detail.
Sure.
But after the war, did your parents or grandmother go back to where they'd come from?
So no. No. So my mother did. My mother and my father both went to Holland quite a lot. My father did a sabbatical year in Delft University. My mother went to Amsterdam quite a lot. Though fascinatingly, on one of her visits, she said to me, I've stopped speaking Dutch when I'm in Holland. And I said, why have you done that? He said, because I've got the accent of an adult, but the vocabulary of a 10-year-old, and people think I'm an imbecile. And she said it was a real problem. So she said, they can all speak English anyway, so I speak English to them now. So we went to Amsterdam a lot when I was a child, and I still really like that. I love Holland. And she had good feelings towards Holland. My father did go back to Poland because he was invited a lot to speak. And he even went to Moscow, which he did not tell Lusha that he went to Moscow, actually, to give speeches, because he felt science was international, and he felt he was doing his bit to kind of liberate those countries if he educated them, and he sort of associated with other scientists there, which is certainly debatable, actually, but it was what he felt. But he never went back to Lviv. And even after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I think it was because he didn't want to look back. I think he was in this country. He once said to me, look, the property's there, I'm here, it's better that way round. And I think that's how he felt. So he was very happy to answer questions about it. He definitely wanted me to tell the story, no question about it. But he But while he definitely would have wanted me to do that, he didn't want to live in the story.
And what about you? Have you visited these places?
So I one of the things I discovered, an extraordinary thing, when so I was at school with, not in the same class as, but 2 or 3 years below or above, I can't even remember. I think I'm slightly younger, a couple of years younger than Philippe Sands, the author of East West Street. We've known each other forever. We're cordial. We've never been close until recently. Now we are. And one of the reasons we are is that when I reviewed his book for the Times, it prompted my brother to read his book. At that point, my brother knew all about the story, which I didn't, bits that I didn't know. And he said, you know what? He is a Landis, and so are we. And Philippe and I worked out that we're third cousins, maybe fourth cousins. We're cousins anyway. And that led our long cordial relationship to become a friendship. And I went with him to Lwow. It was brilliant because he had contacts there, and one of those people persuaded the person who lives in my grandfather's house. So my grandfather lived on this incredible road, the way he'd built this beautiful house, and the Soviets moved in and took this over. So Brezhnev lived there, and when he was in town, and so therefore these houses are still in very good condition with all the original fittings, the guy that lives in my grandfather and grandmother's house now is obsessed with restoring it, even those things, to top quality. And he was pleased for me to come because, I might know some more about the history of it. So he loved that. And so we went to visit this house, which was amazing for the book, both in field terms and also just, in actual physical terms, because I could describe it.
How does this feel to you, knowing that it was stolen?
So my sister's really annoyed by it. I'm a bit more phlegmatic about it. So I'll tell you, I'm going to put it this way, it's a slightly aggrandizing story, but still. When my brother got a knighthood, and I was at his, we had a little party, and I said a few words, because he's my older brother. Normally he says the words, and it was for me this time. I was very proud of him. I am very proud of him. And I pointed out that the Soviets had this idea, right? They're going to destroy the elite. What they're going to do is they're going to steal everything that Lwow had. Multi-millionaire. They'll steal his house, took his business, took his steel mill. They ran it, indeed, under his name, but he had to sort of work in the workshop, and then they sent him off to Siberia and tried to kill him there, and then they sent my father off, and eventually they end up in a little house in Hendon without anything. So they succeed in this kind of erasure. And in a single generation, I'm in the House of Lords, my sister's a permanent secretary in the Treasury, my brother is a knight. It completely failed, right? One generation. I think it's quite an interesting reflection. So I don't feel annoyed about it because we got a great life here and it all turned out fine in the end. And you couldn't get the property back anyway because the whole of the Soviet property system, for years was all based upon theft. And if you to unravel the theft would the whole property system of Russia and Ukraine would collapse.
I think we should open things up to our audience. They've been very patient.
Yes.
Who has a question?
We'll have to have the lights up.
There we go. Okay, so put your hand up and the microphone will come round. Yeah, we'll have this gentleman here.
Just ask, you were working your way through this material much as a historian would, and a historian would be at perhaps one remove emotionally. How did you feel?
Oh, well, that's very good. So I knew a lot of the story, and I felt mainly a sense of satisfaction and often excitement at discovering some new thing that I didn't know. So I didn't know Lwow, my grandfather on my father's side. I didn't know my grandmother, Greta. There was a lot more about Alfred, so I felt I knew him quite well. I'd known my grandmother, Lusha, really very well. And there was an excitement at discovering about things about Lwow and Greta, and we didn't even know how she spelt her name actually. So there was a lot I discovered, and that was really satisfying, emotionally uplifting. But there were a couple of moments that were very difficult, and one of them was describing Sobibor. So most people would know about Auschwitz because people who went every Tuesday, there was a transport to the gas chamber from Westerbork, and people went to Auschwitz much of the time. And when they went to Auschwitz, they were divided. We all know this. Some people were sent straight to the gas chambers, and other people became slave labourers. And the people who became slave labourers, some of those survive, and they live to tell the story. So we all know the story of Auschwitz. In Sobibor, nobody is sent to slave labour. Everybody's killed, and everyone dies within 3 hours. Right? So that's the lifespan of a Jew in Sobibor. My great aunt didn't, as my mother originally thought, die in Sobibor. She didn't in Auschwitz, she died in Sobibor. And reading the process, which I had to do to tell the story, and I wanted people to understand, you couldn't leave that out. That was tough, I have to admit that. And I sort of half wished I could unread it. But it has to be, you can't understand the rest of the story without telling that, so it had to be there. So there were moments in it. And funnily enough, when I read the whole of it now, it's more impactful. But as I was doing it, the excitement of, there's one big bit in it, which is how did my mother get hold of these Paraguayan passports, which was so exciting to discover and which nearly eluded me. And then at the last minute, in incredibly fortuitous circumstances, I discovered the police file of somebody who worked for my grandfather, and the whole story unfolded for me. That was so exciting. So there were moments of excitement that compensated for these kind of terrible downers.
So Ian Valens here. I'm asking you a question as a Holocaust historian of later years, and I'm going to ask you a question about the challenges of telling these multiple stories of the different aspects of your pop all at the same time. So my question is this. I heard the whole of your book on an audio book for 12 hours, because I can't read now. But I had the book in front of me, so I was able to cross-reference from the audio book and listening to that to the family tree that you did, and I was able to cross-reference to some of the pages of your book that I could manage to read for a few minutes. But without a timeline, it was very, very confusing. And I know, speaking to people who have read the book in detail over a period of time, they had challenges because of a lack of timeline.
Yeah,
so my question is, can you persuade the publishers somehow to publish a timeline in some written form so it will make it easier for people to be able to follow?
I'm surprised I haven't had that much, actually. It's just, I don't want to do that. And the reason I didn't do that is because I don't want to tell people what happens. Because the book has in it, as you're aware, a number of points in it where you don't know where it's going. And if I put a timeline in at the front of the book, everyone would know what happened. So I'd be telling people the story. So I had a straightforward choice to make. If you write a book with multiple characters in, it was the same with that amazing book that Hadley Freeman wrote. That's also, I went back and forward to the family tree the whole time. And obviously for her, the characters are fresh in her head, so she knows exactly who they are. I found that, for me, it's a little bit more difficult for people who are listening to it probably to follow the different timelines, but you just cannot eliminate that problem entirely. And the only way of doing it, the only way of helping is to tell people at the beginning of the book exactly the order in which everything happens. But who wants to do that, right? So I couldn't do that because that would have revealed too much of the book. So although you think you'd like a timeline, I think it would have spoilt it more than you think it would. But of course, if you could have had a timeline at the end of the book, that would be great. But then people will be looking at it before that. So I decided not to have it. But I've been aware of it. And honestly, I did the best that I could to make it not confusing. I'm pleased to say that it's quite I think that's actually you're literally the first person ever to say that. But I take it that other people have said it to you, and I just think it was unavoidable.
Any more? Anybody else want to ask a question? No one there?
What impact would you say your family story has had on your political life?
Oh yeah, very good question. Okay, so there are two parts to this. Writing this book makes it very difficult to be as invested as I was beforehand in the political arguments I'm having with Yvette Cooper, right? But by which I mean, once you understand from doing this that the big arguments in human affairs are between those people who believe in liberal democracy within the law and a basic system of free exchange, and those people who don't, the difference of opinion about whether or not, we should have a 2-child limit on universal credit, however vital that debate is and however passionate it might be, it just doesn't become as important. So the first thing I think it introduces is a sense of proportion. And the second thing is it definitely has had the basis of my politics has always been for liberty within the law, for free exchange, for freedom of action, freedom of speech, it's made me, I'm afraid, quite sort of militant on only one thing, which is that I'm against extremism and conspiracy thinking. And it has made me nervous about sweeping schemes of radical change. And so probably the most sort of penetrating criticism on my politics is that it can be complacent because I am a conservative with a small c, and I'm always nervous about big schemes and people with gleam in their eye about how much better they're going to make the world. And I get nervous when people start going, every politician's corrupt and this country is broken and we need to sweep away all these useless people. And a language like sweeping and broken and corrupt makes me nervous.
You've put this book together beautifully. It brings the period and the characters to life very convincingly. You clearly have a talent for writing in that regard. Do you have plans for anything else?
Well, look, at the moment, so I had to make a decision at the beginning. When you're a journalist, you do a column. My first column I ever wrote for the Times, I had a sentence in it which had something like, I also think Pizza Hut is better than Pizza Express and McCartney is better than Lennon. And I realised afterwards I'd spoilt 2 columns for the sake of this sentence. You never throw away whole ideas into columns about something else, right? That's what you learn. So I did have a question at the beginning of this book. Should I write these 2 stories? Or should I do 2 books, or maybe even 3? Because a biography of Alfred would have been a book as well. And I had the additional problem that our friend raised earlier, which is, if you do them, do people get lost in the stories? But I felt that together they were just very powerful as a story about the war, and they drew a picture of the whole war, so I didn't want to separate them. But it does mean I've kind of blown, unquestionably, the greatest story I'll ever have as a journalist is this one. We are going to do, I think there's thought about doing a documentary on it. And I'm also quite interested in doing a young adult version of it. And then I'll think about whether to do another book. I liked writing it, actually. I liked the researching. The writing was quite difficult. And I loved, the publication and all that. So, but whether I'll do another one, I don't know yet.
So you say at the beginning of the book as to whether this could happen again. It could. Absolutely, it could. So what message should our audience take away to make sure that it never happens again?
Okay, so I think the first thing is we have to make the system that we have work, and it has to work for everyone. that means that, I don't believe there's ever been a complete alternative for replacing capitalism. So we have to make capitalism work for everybody, because if it doesn't work for some people, they'll turn against it. And my son often says that with young people turning against the system, that I was offering them an argument, and what they want is a house. And I think he's right. So the first thing, we have to make the system that we've got work. The second is to keep in proportion our complaints about this country and what's happening in it. There's now an extremely strong view the whole country is falling apart, caused by real things, right? There really are very serious problems in public services. There really, obviously, there really have been problems with the concrete in schools. There are, we've had inflation, the cost of living crisis, but we live in an amazing place. In the whole history of mankind, there are fewer better places to live and be than here now, right? We need to get the complaints that we have into proportion and persuade others to do that. And thirdly is to avoid the conspiracy thinking, because it leads very directly to anti-Semitism and to violence, which is the idea that there's a they that is somehow, faking the moon landings and killing John F. Kennedy and, doing 9/11. And in the last week, I've been online with a famous football player who's spreading the idea that the Jews did 9/11. These things are spreading really fast, and we have to try to combat those things. So those are the three things I would say.
Wise words indeed. Well, Danny, thank you for being our guest this evening. A little gift from Milim.
Wonderful.
My photographs of Israeli artists. I hope you'll enjoy that.
That is a proper gift. Thank you very much. Wonderful. Look at that.
And you'll shortly be able to buy a copy of Danny's book in the foyer, and he will be out in just a few minutes to sign your copy if you wish. Some thank yous before that. Can I thank Sue, Sophia Harris, and everyone at the Grammar School at Leeds for hosting this event, Alan Benstock and everyone else at Milim for their help and support, and of course Lord Daniel Finkelstein for being our guest. Thank you, Danny.
Thank you.